Calum Draveth had not smiled in 3 years. Not at the grand feasts his advisors arranged to lift his spirits. Not at the victories his armies brought home from the northern borders. Not even at the small things, the way snow settled on the palace rooftops in winter, or the sound of the courtyard fountain on quiet mornings. Things that had once made him stop and breathe. Those small pleasures had gone away with his brother, and he had stopped looking for them a long time ago. He was not a cruel king. His people were fed, protected, and governed with fairness. But those who served him closely knew the truth, that no royal announcement would ever say out loud, their king was a man who had gone somewhere far inside himself and had not come back. He moved through each day with purpose and precision, signed every document placed before him, made every hard decision without hesitation, and retired each night to his chambers alone. He had built a life that functioned perfectly and felt like nothing. On the night everything changed, Calum was standing on his private balcony. It was late. The palace was quiet. The city below had folded itself into sleep, and the only thing moving was the wind coming up from the southern forest ridge, cool and carrying the faint smell of pine and earth. He stood with both hands on the stone railing, looking out at the dark tree line, not thinking anything in particular, just standing, just existing, which was, in those days, the best he could manage. And then the voice came. It rose from somewhere deep in the trees below, soft at first, barely separable from the wind itself. Then it grew, slowly, into something full and open and completely unguarded. It was a woman's voice, singing an old folk melody, the kind passed down through generations in village homes, the kind no one sang in palaces. There were no trained flourishes in it, no performance. It was simply a voice that had something to say, and was saying it honestly, and the honesty of it was so complete that Calum's entire body went still. He did not move. He did not breathe properly. He stood at that railing and listened with everything he had, the way a man listens when he has forgotten what it feels like to be moved by something, and is suddenly, without warning, being moved completely. The song lasted only a few minutes. Then the wind shifted, the trees settled, and the voice was gone as quietly as it had arrived. Calum stood in the silence it left behind, and realized, with something close to shock, that his chest hurt, not from pain, from feeling. Something inside him, long frozen and untouched, had cracked open just slightly, and the cold air coming through that crack was almost unbearable in how alive it felt. He went back inside. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark with the melody turning over and over in his mind, trying to understand what had just happened to him. He had heard trained singers perform in his great hall. He had attended royal concerts with orchestras, and composed arrangements, and voices polished to perfection. None of it had ever done this. Settled into his bones, pressed against something old and buried, made him feel grief and warmth, and a longing he could not name, all at the same time. By morning, his first general, Roan, found him standing at the window of the war chamber, staring toward the tree line with an expression Roan had never seen on his face before. Not grief, not the usual careful blankness, something else, something unsettled and searching. Roan asked, quietly, if everything was all right. Calum said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned from the window and said, "Issue a royal search." Roan blinked. "For what, my king?" "For a woman," Calum said. "She was singing near the southern forest ridge last night. I need her found." The court, when the decree went out, was stunned into a careful silence. The order was formal, official, stamped with the royal seal. Search every village, within a half-day's ride of the palace. Find the woman who had been singing near the southern ridge on the night of the third moon, and bring her to the court with full honor and no harm. There was no description of her face, no name, no detail at all, only the fact of a voice, heard in the dark, from a great distance. His advisors exchanged looks behind closed doors. In 3 years, the king had asked for nothing personal, not once. And now he had mobilized a kingdom-wide search for a woman he had never seen, based only on the sound of her singing drifting up through the trees at midnight. No one said anything to his face, but every person in that palace was thinking the same quiet, wondering thought. Something had shifted in their king. Something significant. The search spread outward through the villages, like water finding its level. Royal messengers arrived in market towns and river settlements, asking questions, requesting that women come forward. Some did eagerly, hoping for royal favor or adventure. Some were frightened. Everywhere the story traveled, it grew stranger and more romantic in the retelling. The Alpha King, stone-faced and unreachable for 3 years, was looking for a mysterious girl whose voice had undone him. By the time the story reached the smaller villages tucked against the forest edge, it had already become something close to legend. In the village of Ashfen, Saren Ashvale heard the news at the herb market on a Tuesday morning. She heard it the way she heard most things, quietly, while keeping her hands busy and her face neutral. She was arranging dried lavender bundles when the woman at the neighboring stall leaned over and told her about the royal search with wide, excited eyes. Saren listened. She nodded at the appropriate moments. Then she finished arranging her lavender, sold 3 bundles before noon, packed up her stall, and walked home. Her stomach was tight the entire way. She knew. She had known from the moment the other woman said the words, Southern Forest Ridge, and the night of the 3rd moon. Saren had been there that night, later than usual, in the spot between the 2 oldest oak trees, where the ground was soft and the city noise couldn't reach. She had been there because her grandmother had been having a difficult week, and the weight of it had grown too heavy to carry in silence. She had sung because she always sang when the weight got too heavy. It was not a performance. It was not an offering. It was simply the only language she had for things that had no other words. She had not thought anyone could hear her from the palace ridge. It had never occurred to her. That night, she did not go to the forest. She sat beside her grandmother's bed and thought for a long time. She was not afraid of the king exactly. She was afraid of being seen. She was afraid of being pulled from the small, manageable life she had built. The herb stall, the familiar roads, the grandmother who needed her, the evening walks that belonged only to her. Saren had spent a great portion of her life learning how to take up just the right amount of space. Not too much, not enough to become a target for anyone's attention or expectation. A royal summons was the exact opposite of that careful, invisible life she had constructed. She decided simply not to come forward. It was a reasonable decision. There were hundreds of women near that ridge. The search would pass through Ashfen, find nothing definitive, and move on. She would remain exactly what she had always been, a village girl with calloused hands, and a voice she kept for the trees. What she had not accounted for was old Meret. The royal messengers arrived in Ashfen 10 days later, 2 of them, polite and official, moving through the market and asking questions. Saren saw them coming from 3 stalls away and kept her eyes down, her hands moving steadily over her herb bundles. She was almost in the clear. They were nearly past her when old Meret, who sold honey 2 stalls over and had known Saren since she was a child, looked up brightly and said, "If it's a singing voice you're after, you want this one here. Finest voice on the whole forest ridge. I'd wager my best jar on it." The messengers turned. Saren looked up slowly. She met their eyes. She said nothing. There was nothing useful left to say. The royal invitation arrived 3 days later. A folded letter sealed in gold wax, delivered to her door with ceremony and courtesy. She was not being dragged anywhere. She was being asked. She could bring a companion. She was given 3 days to prepare. The letter was formal and respectful, and left her absolutely no dignified way to refuse. Her grandmother, propped against her pillows, and watching Saren read the letter for the 3rd time, said simply, "Go. Whatever is waiting for you, go." Saren folded the letter. She packed her one good dress, her herb satchel out of habit, and the particular kind of fear that comes not from danger, but from the unknown shape of what is about to change. She had never left Ashfen. She had never stood before anyone who held real power. She was 23 years old, and the largest room she had ever been in was the village meeting hall. The palace was incomprehensibly large. She kept her face composed as she was escorted through the main entrance hall, though her heart was doing something loud and irregular behind her ribs. Courtiers stared. She was clearly not what they had expected. No fine clothes, no practiced posture, no air of mystery or nobility. Just a young woman from a village, moving through corridors of polished stone with her chin level and her eyes taking in everything carefully. She was brought to a receiving chamber and told the king would be with her shortly. She sat in a chair that was larger than her grandmother's entire wardrobe and breathed slowly and waited. Calum walked in without announcement. He was taller than she had imagined, though she wasn't sure why she had been imagining anything. He was also younger looking than the portrait that hung in the village meeting hall, the one that made him look carved from something ancient and serious. In person, he looked like a man who carried a great deal and had learned to carry it without showing the weight. He looked at her the way someone looks at something they have been trying to understand for weeks and are finally seeing clearly. He sat across from her. There was a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. Then he said, "Was it you?" She had planned to be careful. She had planned several measured diplomatic ways to answer that question. What came out instead was simply, yes. He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already known. Then he asked why she had been in the forest ridge alone at that hour. She told him the truth, that it was the only place no one could hear her. The irony of that answer, given the circumstances, settled between them quietly, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to one. They talked for a long time, longer than either of them expected. He did not ask her to perform for his court or to explain herself in any official capacity. He asked about her life with a directness that surprised her, not the patronizing curiosity of someone powerful examining someone small, but the genuine questions of a person who actually wanted to know. She answered honestly, because something in the room made dishonesty feel unnecessary. Before she left the chamber, he asked one more thing. He asked if she would sing, just once, just there, just for him. She told him she had never sung for anyone on purpose in her life. He said, "Then pretend I'm not here." She almost laughed at that. She didn't quite, but she closed her eyes, and after a long pause in which the room was completely silent, she sang. Calum sat entirely still, and for the first time in 3 years, his eyes grew wet. She stayed 2 more days, though no one had asked her to. She walked the palace gardens in the early mornings when they were empty, and the light was still soft and golden. On the second morning, Calum found her there. Not entirely by accident, she suspected. They talked again, easier this time, without the formality of the receiving chamber around them. He told her about his brother. She told him about her grandmother. They were 2 people who had each, in their own way, learned to make themselves unreachable, and they recognized that in each other, with a quiet, unsettling clarity. On the 3rd morning, Saren packed her bag to leave. She knew what she felt. She also knew what she was, a girl from a village, with an herb stall, and no place in a world of stone corridors and royal protocol. She said goodbye to Calum in the main hallway, with composure and gratitude, and the particular dignity of someone holding themselves together carefully. He stood in the corridor and watched her go and said nothing to stop her. He let her leave. Then he stood at his window for a very long time, watching the road below until it was empty. 6 weeks passed. Saren went back to her life. She tended her grandmother. She opened her stall. She walked to the ridge in the evenings, but the singing that came out of her now was different, slower, and sadder, and full of things she was trying not to think about. Then the letter came. It was not official, no gold seal, no royal heading, just plain folded parchment in careful handwriting, the handwriting of someone not used to writing things that were personal rather than powerful. He wrote that he could not explain the silence she had left. He wrote that he was not a man who knew how to ask for things he had no right to ask for. He wrote that he was asking anyway. He asked her to come back, not for the court, not for any purpose of the kingdom, just to come back. Saren sat on the floor of her kitchen and read the letter twice. Then she held it against her chest and closed her eyes. Her grandmother called softly from the next room. "Well?" Saren opened her eyes. She looked at the window. She looked at the letter in her hands. "We're going to need to pack," she said. She went back. She brought her grandmother. She arrived in a plain wagon on a bright morning and stepped down onto the palace road and looked up, and Calum was standing at the top of the steps. Not surrounded by guards, not in ceremony, just standing there, hands at his sides, watching her the way a person watches something they were afraid they would never see again. He came down the steps. He did not say anything grand or rehearsed. He simply offered his hand to help her grandmother down from the wagon, gently, carefully, without making a moment of it. Saren watched him do that small, quiet thing, and she understood, in that moment, that she was entirely lost. The good kind of lost, the kind you stop trying to find your way back from. The kingdom never learned the full story. They only knew that their king, somewhere between a palace balcony and a village herb stall, had found his way back to being human. That was the part that mattered, and it was more than enough.